The title sounds like hyperbole, like cheap marketing for a historical thriller. But in the 15th century, when the Byzantine Empire was collapsing under Ottoman pressure, when Constantinople fell in 1453, marking the end of the ancient world's last vestige, when Greek scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts containing the collected knowledge of classical civilization, it was Italian bankers, particularly the Medici family and their network of merchant bankers across Italy, who funded the preservation and dissemination of this knowledge, who patronized the scholars and artists and architects who would create the Renaissance, who built the financial infrastructure that allowed European civilization to transition from medieval feudalism to early modernity, and who did all this not primarily from altruism, but from profit-seeking and status-seeking. Yet the effect was to save Western civilization at a critical moment when it could have descended into sustained decline, when the knowledge of Greece and Rome could have been lost, when the transition to modernity could have been delayed for centuries. And while saved is dramatic language, the counterfactual where Italian merchant bankers didn't accumulate the wealth and use it to patronize learning and arts suggests that European civilization's trajectory would have been radically different and probably much worse. So understanding what these bankers did, how they accumulated their wealth, why they chose to spend it, patronizing culture rather than just consuming luxuries, and what effects their patronage had on European development reveals a crucial and underappreciated connection between finance and civilization, between the accumulation of merchant capital and the flowering of culture, between banking and the preservation of knowledge that would later enable scientific revolution and enlightenment. The Medici Bank, founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in 1397 and expanded dramatically by his son Cosimo and grandson Lorenzo, was the largest and most sophisticated financial institution in Europe during the 15th century, with branches across Italy and major European cities, London, Bruges, Geneva, Lyon. And it provided a range of services that went far beyond simple lending. They handled currency exchange across the fragmented European monetary landscape, where dozens of currencies circulated. They managed deposits and transfers for merchants and nobles. They facilitated the papal finances, collecting revenues from across Christendom and transferring them to Rome. They financed trade by providing letters of credit and bills of exchange. They engaged in commodity trading, particularly wool and silk and alum, and they made loans to kings and princes, risky but potentially very profitable. And through all these activities they accumulated an enormous fortune. Cosimo de' Medici was probably the wealthiest individual in Europe in the mid-15th century, wealthier than most kings because his wealth was liquid, was money and financial instruments rather than land and feudal obligations, and this gave him a form of power that traditional nobles lacked. He could deploy capital quickly, could respond to opportunities, could fund projects that required upfront investment, and crucially, he could do all this while maintaining the fiction that he was just a private citizen. Florence was nominally a republic. The Medici held no official position, but Cosimo controlled the city through financial power and patronage networks, and this allowed him to operate with fewer constraints than a king would face. The context was the collapse of Constantinople, which occurred on May 29, 1453, when Ottoman forces under Mehmed II finally breached the walls after a 2-month siege. This was catastrophic not just militarily, but culturally, because Constantinople had preserved Greek learning through the medieval period, while Western Europe largely forgot it. The libraries of Constantinople contained thousands of manuscripts of classical texts, Plato and Aristotle, and the Greek tragedians and mathematicians and physicians. And when the city fell, scholars fled, many heading to Italy where they found refuge and employment, and Italian bankers, particularly the Medici, employed these scholars, funded them to translate Greek texts into Latin, established libraries and academies where classical learning could be studied, and this created the conditions for the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning that would transform European culture. And while the Renaissance had other causes and contributors, the role of Italian merchant bankers in funding it was crucial. They provided the capital that paid for scholars and books and buildings and artworks. They created the demand for classical culture by valuing it themselves and signaling its value to others. And they did this on a scale that churches and princes couldn't match because the church was in crisis and princes were perpetually short of money. So private merchant capital filled the gap. Cosimo de' Medici spent an estimated 663,000 florins on architectural projects and artistic patronage during his lifetime. This is roughly equivalent to 500 million modern dollars, accounting for inflation and economic growth, an enormous sum that funded the rebuilding of churches and monasteries across Florence, the construction of the Medici Palace, the establishment of the Platonic Academy, where Marsilio Ficino translated Plato's works into Latin, the support of artists like Donatello and Fra Angelico, the collection of manuscripts that would become the core of the Laurentian Library. And Cosimo's spending wasn't just consumption, it was investment in cultural capital, in building Florence's reputation as a center of learning and art, which attracted talent and trade and enhanced the city's status. And it was investment in the Medici family's position. By being the foremost patron of culture, Cosimo secured his family's place in Florentine society in ways that money alone couldn't. He bought legitimacy through cultural patronage, transformed merchant wealth into cultural authority, and this was rational calculation as much as love of art, though Cosimo seems to have genuinely appreciated learning and beauty as well. The mechanism was patronage. Wealthy individuals and families would commission works from artists and scholars, would fund their living expenses in exchange for creating works that brought glory to the patron, and this system allowed talented individuals without independent means to dedicate themselves to art and scholarship. Brunelleschi designing the dome of Florence Cathedral, Michelangelo sculpting David, Ficino translating Plato. All of these were funded by patrons, primarily merchant bankers, who paid for the work and owned the results. And this created an explosion of cultural production. Because suddenly there was market for culture, talented people could make a living producing it, and patrons competed with each other to employ the best artists and scholars, creating a virtuous cycle where artistic achievement brought status, which brought more patronage, which enabled more achievement. And the concentration of wealth in merchant hands, particularly in Florence and Venice, and other Italian commercial cities, meant there was enough capital to fund culture on unprecedented scale. The Medici alone couldn't have created the Renaissance, but they were the largest single contributor, and their example encouraged other wealthy families to patronize culture similarly. The Russelli and Strozzi in Florence, the Doge's Palace in Venice, the Sforza in Milan, all spending merchant or banking fortunes on art and architecture and learning. The preservation of classical texts was perhaps the most important contribution. When Constantinople fell, the manuscripts it contained were at risk. Many were destroyed or scattered, but Italian bankers funded the rescue of hundreds of texts. They paid agents to travel to the East and buy manuscripts. They employed Greek scholars as translators. They established scriptoria where manuscripts were copied, and they built libraries to house the results. The Vatican Library was funded largely by papal bankers. The Medici established the Laurentian Library, the Malatesta Library in Cesena, the Marciana in Venice. These were massive projects requiring sustained funding over decades, and they succeeded in preserving the core of classical knowledge. Virtually everything we have from ancient Greek literature and philosophy comes through manuscripts preserved in this period. If Italian bankers hadn't funded this preservation, if the fall of Constantinople had coincided with European inability to absorb the fleeing scholars and texts, much of classical learning might have been permanently lost, and Western civilization would have developed very differently. The Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, all drew heavily on recovered classical texts, on Plato and Aristotle and Euclid and Galen. And these texts were preserved primarily through merchant capital deployed by Italian bankers who understood their value. The economic logic of cultural patronage is worth examining, because it seems irrational. Why would profit-maximizing bankers spend enormous sums on art and scholarship that generated no financial return? The answer is multifaceted. First, status competition. In societies where traditional nobility looked down on merchants as lowborn, cultural patronage was a way to claim higher status, to demonstrate that merchants weren't just money grubbers, but cultivated individuals who appreciated beauty and learning. Cosimo de' Medici, styling himself as Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, couldn't have done that through banking alone. He needed the cultural capital that patronage provided. Second, legitimacy. The Medici effectively ruled Florence despite having no legal authority to do so. Their power was informal. based on controlling credit and patronage networks. And cultural patronage helped legitimize this irregular power, made them seem like benefactors rather than tyrants. Third, genuine interest. Many of these bankers were educated, appreciated art and philosophy, wanted to be remembered for more than accumulating money. Cosimo reportedly said he'd spent his wealth on three things: buildings, books, and wars. And of these he regretted only the wars, suggesting he genuinely valued the cultural patronage. Fourth, diversification of legacy. Financial fortunes can disappear. Banking houses can fail, but buildings and artworks and libraries persist. The Medici Bank eventually failed, collapsed in the late 15th century from bad loans and mismanagement. But the cultural legacy remained. Florentine churches and palaces and libraries still exist, still bear the Medici name. So cultural patronage was insurance against financial failure, a way to ensure the family would be remembered even if the bank failed. The Fugger family of Augsburg provides another example. They were the Medici's main rivals as Europe's leading bankers in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, and they accumulated even greater wealth through financing the Habsburgs and through monopolizing Central European silver and copper production. And the Fuggers also engaged in cultural patronage, though less spectacularly than the Medici. They built the Fuggerai, the world's oldest social housing complex, still operating. Today, they patronized artists including Albrecht Dürer. They funded churches and established foundations. And like the Medici, they used their wealth to gain status and influence. Jacob Fugger, the richest of the family, was made a count of the Holy Roman Empire, bought noble status with banking profits. And this transformation from merchant to noble through cultural patronage and strategic lending was a pattern repeated across Europe. Banking wealth was translated into cultural capital and eventually into formal nobility. And this wasn't just personal ambition. It was necessary for business. Nobles wouldn't deal as equals with merchants. But if the merchants became patrons of culture and holders of titles, they could interact with nobility on better terms, could arrange better business deals. So cultural patronage had commercial logic as well as status logic. The counterfactual is speculative but instructive. If Italian bankers hadn't accumulated wealth and deployed it in cultural patronage, if merchant capital hadn't funded the Renaissance, what would have happened to classical learning and to European development? The church couldn't have funded the Renaissance. It was in crisis in the 15th century. The Western Schism had divided it. Corruption was endemic. Resources were tied up in internal conflicts, and the church was ideologically opposed. To much classical learning, pagan philosophy and literature were suspect. The church preserved some classical texts, but it was selective, favored works that could be reconciled with Christianity, and secular bankers had no such constraints. They could and did patronize the recovery of all classical texts, including those the church found problematic, and European princes couldn't have funded the Renaissance either. They were perpetually short of money, fighting wars, dealing with rebellious nobles. They occasionally patronized artists, but not on the sustained systematic scale that Italian bankers did. So without merchant capital, the preservation of classical learning would have been partial, haphazard, much more limited, and the Renaissance might not have occurred, or would have been much weaker, occurring later and with less impact. And this would have delayed the scientific revolution, which drew on recovered classical mathematics and natural philosophy, would have delayed the Enlightenment, which drew on classical political philosophy. The entire trajectory of Western development would have been altered. The irony is that the bankers who saved Western civilization did so through activities that were religiously prohibited or at least problematic. Banking, lending at interest, accumulating wealth through financial manipulation rather than honest labor. These were condemned by the church. Bankers were seen as usurers, risking damnation, and many bankers were genuinely worried about this. In their wills, they would make large charitable donations to try to compensate for their usurious profits, to buy their way into heaven, and cultural patronage served this function too. Building churches and funding religious art and supporting monasteries was a way to atone for banking profits, to use ill-gotten gains for holy purposes. So the same activities that the church condemned, banking and interest-taking, generated the wealth that funded the cultural flowering, including religious art and architecture, that defines the Renaissance. And the church accepted this contradiction because it needed. The bankers, the papacy was the Medici Bank's largest client, relied on the Medici to collect and transfer papal revenues from across Europe, So the church condemned usury in principle while depending on usurers in practice. And this hypocrisy was recognized at the time, was a source of anger that would fuel the Protestant Reformation, but it also enabled the Renaissance, allowed banker wealth to be laundered through cultural patronage into respectability. The transition from medieval to modern economy was facilitated by Italian bankers in multiple ways beyond cultural patronage. They created financial instruments that enabled capitalism, double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed accurate tracking of complex business operations, bills of exchange, which enabled credit across distances, marine insurance, which reduced trading risks, limited partnership structures, which allowed capital pooling while limiting individual liability. These innovations came primarily from Italian merchant bankers in the 14th and 15th centuries, and they were necessary preconditions for modern capitalism. You couldn't have large-scale commerce without these tools, couldn't organize complex businesses or manage risk or raise capital efficiently. And Italian bankers also created markets, commodity exchanges, insurance markets, currency markets. They linked European economies into increasingly integrated networks, facilitated specialization and trade. And this economic integration was necessary for the later development of European power. A fragmented feudal Europe couldn't have competed globally with the Ottoman Empire or China, but an economically integrated Europe with sophisticated financial institutions could mobilize resources on larger scale, could fund exploration and colonization and eventually industrial revolution. So Italian bankers didn't just save classical culture, they created the economic infrastructure for European modernity. The decline of Italian banking dominance in the 16th century came from multiple factors. The shift of trade routes from Mediterranean to Atlantic after the discovery of the Americas, the rise of northern European banking centers, particularly Antwerp and later Amsterdam, the political fragmentation of Italy, which made it vulnerable to invasion and occupation by France and Spain, and the failures of individual banking houses from risky loans to princes who defaulted. But the innovations Italian bankers created persisted, were adopted and elaborated by their successors in the north. Dutch and English bankers built on Italian foundations, used the same techniques on larger scale with more capital, and the cultural legacy of Italian banking patronage also persisted. The Renaissance didn't end when Italian banking declined. It spread north. The Northern Renaissance in Flanders and Germany, and eventually England, drew on the cultural revival that Italian bankers had funded. So even after Italian banking's decline, its effects continued to shape European development. The question of whether we should credit bankers with saving civilization or whether this gives too much agency to individuals and too little to broader structural forces is worth considering. Certainly, the preservation of classical learning and the Renaissance had multiple causes. Population recovery after the Black Death, creating markets for culture. The invention of printing, making books cheaper and more available. The competition among Italian city-states, creating demand for cultural prestige. The particular confluence of talent in 15th century Italy. All of these mattered, and civilization probably wouldn't have collapsed if Italian bankers hadn't existed. Someone else would have patronized culture, perhaps less efficiently, but the fact remains that at a crucial moment, when classical texts were at risk and European culture could have developed differently, Italian bankers deployed capital to preserve and disseminate that knowledge, and they did so on a scale and with a systematicity that no other institution could match. The church was too poor and too ideologically constrained. Princes were too focused on warfare. Only merchant bankers had the combination of wealth, freedom, and motivation to fund the Renaissance. So while they didn't single-handedly save civilization, they were crucial contributors. Their role was necessary, if not sufficient. And recognizing this challenges our assumptions about the relationship between finance and culture, between profit-seeking and public good. The bankers who saved Western civilization did so inadvertently. They weren't consciously trying to preserve civilization. They were trying to enhance their status, legitimize their power, assuage their religious guilt, demonstrate their sophistication, compete with rivals, and yes, genuinely appreciate beauty and learning. But the aggregate effect of these individual motivations was to fund the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge at a critical moment, to create the conditions for Renaissance humanism, to enable the cultural transformation that would eventually lead to modern science and philosophy and political thought. And this shows how private interest and public good can align, how profit-seeking institutions can generate enormous positive externalities. The Medici made their money through banking, through exploiting arbitrage opportunities and taking cuts of transactions, activities that created some value but were primarily extractive, but they spent their money on culture, on activities that created public goods, knowledge and beauty that benefited everyone. And while they captured private benefits from this spending, status, and legitimacy, the social benefits far exceeded the private benefits. The buildings and artworks and libraries they created enriched Florence and European civilization generally for centuries after the Medici Bank failed. So there's a case that merchant bankers, despite their rapacity and despite the exploitative aspects of their businesses, were net positive for civilization. And this complicates simplistic narratives about finance being purely parasitic or destructive. Yes, finance extracts value. Yes, bankers often get rich through rent-seeking and manipulation, but at least in the Renaissance case, banking wealth was deployed in ways that advanced civilization, and perhaps we should recognize that pattern and think about how to encourage it, how to channel private wealth toward public goods, how to make status seeking and legacy-building work for social benefit rather than just private consumption. The Italian bankers who saved Western civilization in the 15th century show that it's possible, that merchant capital and cultural flourishing aren't opposites, but can be complements, that the pursuit of status through cultural patronage can have civilization-level impacts, and that sometimes the right combination of wealth, freedom, and motivation in private hands can accomplish things that states and churches cannot, preserving and advancing human knowledge and culture at moments when it might otherwise be lost. And that's a lesson worth remembering, that finance and civilization aren't eternally opposed, that properly directed private wealth can serve public purposes, that the bankers who saved Western civilization did so not through altruism, but through pursuing their own interests in ways that happened to benefit everyone, and that this accidental alignment of private interest and public good, when it occurs, can change the course of history.